We had a kid that it had applied to all these schools, and all the students and friends around him are getting into schools, and he got into a couple but was waiting on the schools he wanted or had been waitlisted on the schools he wanted. And it can be, unfortunately, a very stressful time. And at the end of the day,
Humbling.
I'm
It's
convinced
a humbling experience.
it's a very humbling experience. And by the way, we talk about this a lot. You can't protect your kids from all, like, sometimes things don't work out and you might not get into the school you want. And that's unfortunately life. That sounds harsh, but the sooner our kids learn that it's not always going to work out for them and how to cope and see the forest through the trees and see the good things that come out of it, the better for them.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
and if they don't have things not go their way in your house, then there's no way to predict how they're going to handle it outside of your house. I'd rather have that happen.
Yeah.
Those disappointments early on.
Right.
And many of them, honestly, because that's life.
Exactly. And hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Life After Kids with Doctors Brooke and Lynne. I'm Dr. Brooke.
And I'm Dr. Lynne.
Thank you for joining us, ladies.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We're having a constructive conversation today. Many of you have seniors, juniors, kids still in high school, basically, that are thinking about college and might be figuring out that whole animal, which is navigating the college process.
Yeah. This was, I just went through it in back-to-back years, and that was a lot. And it kind of depends on where you stand with it too, because, it all depends on what your kid wants and what your expectations are and a lot of those things. But like, it's a tricky thing if they have their heart set on a school, that's a little bit difficult to get into, or like there's a lot of things to navigate depending on what you want from the process, right?
Right. And I have a couple of friends who, their kids completely did everything from soup to nuts on their own. And, while I can say my daughter did most of it, she did obviously all the essays and work on her own. There were a few places that we stepped in to guide, and I thought it was helpful. We'd gotten such great advice from you, having gone through it the year before.
Mm-hmm.
And when I speak to parents in underclassmen that I know that are, just sort of like, they don't even know what questions to ask. You can just tell that there's a lot you don't even know until you start to open up that can of worms.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's one of those topics that especially if you do want to get into an out-of-state school, that can be tricky depending on the admittance, acceptance rates. You can't snooze on that. It's not something you can cram unless your child's a genius, which then they probably have their pick of colleges to start with.
Yeah. So here, this is, we can just go and head first into this because this is a big deal. And one thing that we really didn't realize until we got into the thick of it.
Are you talking about you and Ken?
And Andrew. Mm-hmm. To your point about the state schools, okay? Because we're in New England, we're in Massachusetts, which, by the way, ironically, Massachusetts has so many good colleges in state.
Yes.
That if you live in state, they're a little bit easier for you to get into.
Mm-hmm.
But Andrew wanted to go south. So he's looking at all these schools and come to find out that they're state schools. They're not private schools. And what that means is they take first all the kids in that state. And the bar might be a little lower for them to get in.
They have to.
Right. Because some of them are also state. They get subsidized by the state. So they have to take like this percentage of kids in state that's easier to get into. But if you're coming in out of state, like some of these schools, we found out we're like, he's going to have an easier chance to get into an Ivy League school than to get into this state school. And and it doesn't mean that education was better. It's just the way it is.
Right, because there's a certain small number of seats left over. We'll call them seats, butts in classrooms. Small number of spaces, say, for kids outside of that state.
Yeah.
And then if it's a really desirable school, like a, Florida State or South Carolina, there's
University of South Carolina is a good example.
Wanting to go there.
University of Florida is another good example.
Right. University of Miami.
Mm-hmm. Well, University of Miami, I think, is a private school.
Okay. Sorry. So those are state schools and private schools, which we'll get to in just a moment. But the point is now you're competing because everybody wants to go to school in Florida. It sounds great, right? It sounds good to me.
If you live in the north and you want to break from
Yeah,
the winter, the south
exactly.
sounds good.
Exactly. So now you're competing against other kids from all over the country.
Yeah.
And it's at that point, it's the best of the best, the cream of the crop
Yes.
that are going to get chosen. And other factors like geographic region, like uniqueness of your geographic region. So if you've got 100 kids from Massachusetts all wanting to go to South Carolina, you're getting pitted against them.
Yes, it's
and
a tricky
the rest
thing.
of the country.
And that happened to us with Clemson because that's a case in point. In our area, there are so many kids from Massachusetts in the New England area now that have wanted to go to Clemson, and they have a high rate of kids applying from this area. And schools not only want a diversity of candidates, they also want a diversity in demographic, meaning like where you are from,
Yes.
where you live. And so they don't want an overwhelming pool of people. They try to spread it out. So if you have a ton of people from New England, but you want to spread it out, it's going to set the bar higher for the kids trying to get in from New
that
England.
was an aha moment for me
Mhm.
when you first started talking about that. And he was saying he wanted to go to South Carolina. I was like, well, sure. And then you were like, but you understand like his chances.
The high school that my kids are at, they had assigned to them a college advisor who that's all they did. Like, and that's their job at the school. They don't do anything else. That's what they're hired for. And they walked them step by step, starting depending on where your kid is, know this too. Like, it's not too soon to start. And starting in as soon as we got back from the holiday break, junior year, the meetings started and things started to ramp up. And most of Andrew's and Anthony's application was done at the end of the summer before they headed into senior year. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's how our process went. And I didn't say that to tell you all that, but I said that because if your child's not at a school where they have that built into the school, and depending on where they're hoping to get into and what their aspirations are, it is money well spent. And every mom that I have talked to that has hired somebody to help them and their child walk through that process, it was worth its weight in gold.
Yeah. Because that's when the paperwork will start. But the process, depending on where your child wants to go, of preparing your resume and, as the student, not the parent, but that starts a whole lot sooner, depending on what school you want to go to.
So if you don't have the opportunity, if your child doesn't have the opportunity through school to have a college advisor, it's worth its weight in gold. And many moms have told me that, depending again on their aspirations and what type of school they want to go to and what their goals are.
Yes.
And I think did you have a counselor through your school?
We have a counselor through our school. He wasn't super personalized. So his role is to deliver information to the entire class, not to individual students, if that makes sense. He's available for consulting, but we didn't find him super helpful beyond us just meeting with him once. And he asked us some good questions to help us narrow our search.
Yeah.
And helped us to use the platform. A lot of schools we use the SCORE platform to help organize everything and for colleges to communicate with your student.
Yeah.
And so he helped us to learn how to navigate that. That being said, inside, if your school uses something like that inside of there are a lot of like what you should do, or you could also use, I know Ken had given us a couple niche, so niche.com.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of the other website? I think there's a couple of them that are similar, and you can go on, learn about the school. If you're thinking about Duke, or if you're thinking about, you can put in a set of criteria. Like, I want a town that's at least 100,000 that's in the Midwest, because there's so many colleges out there, there could be a really great school for your child in their area of interest of study that would check all of their boxes that you haven't even heard of.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, that's what happened with us with TCU. My middle son, Andrew's at TCU, which is in Texas Christian University. And it wasn't even on our radar. So what our process looked like, and I think this is a really good thing to do, even if you don't have a college advisor, just to walk your kid with. And the first conversations were like, he filled out this survey, but you could replicate it. It doesn't have to be like survey form, but just talk with your child. what's the biggest thing you want out of your school? Do you see yourself in a city, or do you see yourself in a small town? Do you want access to the outdoors? Do you want, like, how many people do you want on campus? Are sports teams important to you? Or like all of these questions to get them kind of niched into like what they think they want. And then on top of that, they told us sometime like starting at least junior year in the spring, if you have a child that's open to it. Andrew was not, but if the child's open to it and doesn't feel stress of doing it sooner, start looking at different types of colleges, really big schools, really small schools, city, not, so that they get a feel for what they want. But that's where we started. And so when we went into our first conversation with him, he already knew what Andrew was looking for. And Andrew had the list of his schools that Ken and I had sort of guided him on, and things that he had found on his own. And TCU wasn't on that list. And it's so ironic because we're just wrapping up that first meeting. And Ian, our advisor, was like, Andrew, one more school that's not on your list, but it checks all your boxes. And it's such a great school. It's a great education. And the people I know that have gone there absolutely love it. And it's TCU. And I was like, TCU? I didn't even know, honestly, like, no offense to any frog, but like at that time, I didn't really pay attention, right? Well, Andrew knew about it because they'd just come off the year with Max Duggan and they had done really well in football. And Andrew was like really into sports. So he's like, oh yeah, that would be a good one to look at. But we would have never even, so to your point, and that being said, TCU is a really well-known school. So think of all the schools that even fly further under the radar that you just don't know about.
Yeah, I mean, there's thousands. Dare we say hundreds
I don't know.
of thousands? I don't
Not
know
good
how
with
far
numbers.
we're creeping up there. Yeah, I'm making that up. But there's so many.
Yeah.
And so what these tools do are they help narrow down your search based on your criteria. And that's a great way to approach it, right? It's a great way to approach it. You talked about visiting campuses. I mean, that's also something you can't quite, it's an intangible, but if you're on a campus, and visiting during, especially if it's during school, I don't recommend. We did it a couple times, but like we visited SMU on a Sunday, and it's actually going to play against that school because you're not going to feel like the living, breathing heartbeat of what is happening during that day. But not everybody can visit to every single school. The best chance to getting to the ones that you really feel are important, though, is to really start early. So I'm telling you, it's not too soon to do that process in your freshman year, your kid's freshman year.
It's really not. It's not. I think, once again, that depends on the kid, because with Andrew, anytime we tried to even just have a conversation, even throughout his sophomore year, he's like, nope, I can't think about it. It stressed him out because he was in no way, shape, or form prepared to be out on his own, and just thinking about it stressed him. And so just be aware of that too, because maybe your kid is not one that would voice it, but just read between the lines and don't push him if they're not, him or her, if they're not open about it. If they are, great, go for it. I don't think it would be too soon, because it will. But then there's also a point where then if you start that early and you see all of these schools, it can be overwhelming, because then by the time you get to the time you have to apply, it's like, there were so many I saw. So that it's just, navigate that which you think is best for your family. But it isn't, because to your point, depending on how many schools you want to apply to, you just might not be enough time. Life is busy, and they're in high school and it's busy. So, and if they have another activity outside of school, one or more, it's even harder to get them away.
Well, and if they absolutely fall in love with a school that is out of their reach, it's one of their reach schools, there are things that they can do in their freshman and sophomore year. They'll be more motivated to do the extra volunteering, get the extra job, like join the clubs that they need to be able to build.
It's huge.
What it is that's required, or study more for the ACT, or study more for their grades, right? Take harder classes, all of the things that go into being selected for a college.
Yes, thank you for saying that, because if your child is someone who is super motivated and really has their heart set on a school, and they need that help and that feedback, then yes, go for it. And what you're saying is absolutely true, because the schools are they're mostly looking at your junior year, senior year, but they want to see a progression in grades. They want to see good grades, mostly that you're progressing and not going backwards. And they're going to look at what you've done that whole time extracurricularly, any volunteering that you've done. Have you had a job? Like, so you can start all that from an early age. And from what I've seen, it's getting harder and harder. Like getting into the schools is sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to whether you got in or not. It's just like the littlest things that gives you a jump. And at the end of the day, I don't think, being at the perfect school is not the end all be all. So I think we're having this conversation speaking to the mom and who has the kids that really want that for themselves, and what can you do about it? Because there's plenty of schools that are state schools or schools that will be easy for your child to get into, and guess what, they're
More
going to do great
affordable.
too, right?
Yeah. And that's the majority of, I think, the people that I know, their kids are going to a great state school, and they're going to, or they're joining the military or trade school, which, by the way, is,
I'll tell you,
amazing and super smart.
there's not, I mean, my nephew is going that way. He's a senior now, and it's like for him almost a no-brainer, and he'll be able to do like there's such a need for that. The need is never going away for people that can do a trade. And you can take that, make your own business out of
You
it.
can
I
be
mean, you can do,
you could work for
so
a
there's
company.
all different routes and aspects that our kids can go. College, I don't want to sound like we're elitist, like this is the only way, right? But if you are thinking that way, we do have some experience because what our kids have chosen to do.
Right. It's a confusing process, and I think it's good to be proactive with, especially with this topic. So
yeah, I agree.
And if I had my time back,
like for yourself or with Lila?
for myself, but also in like guiding my daughter. Tough schools are not everything. She's very happy with the school that she's chosen, and at the end of the day, that's all that matters. And I just know she's going to have a great experience. But the tougher schools to get into, as a parent, there's something comforting about having your child attend that, because although it's not guaranteed, the reason why those schools are so coveted is because there's a reputation about them that makes them more easily, makes it easier for them to get a job or to have access to a network of people.
It's true.
That will propel their career.
Right. And to your point, there are two things to think about there that I would have never considered. Number one is if your child, and this is kind of a difficult thing because our kids are young when they're going to college, and they oftentimes don't really know what they want or where they want to live. But if for some reason, let's use me as an example hypothetically, that you've been in New England, you've been in the Boston area, your kid wants to go out of state to school, but they also know that they want to come back into the state, and they're choosing a route like business. Well, then you should probably look at the schools that they go to and where they place. Because, for example,
as in where they place their interns or where they place their
where
jobs,
people get jobs coming out, because
Gotcha.
Typically, for example, a school like TCU is going to have a high placement in the Dallas area, the Fort Worth area, the Houston area, and like surrounding cities
that
and
makes
states.
Sense.
Clemson, you're more likely to get a job likely in like Atlanta, in southern areas. So that's something to consider too. If you can start to think that far ahead, it's an important
As
thing.
in, what you're getting at is, does your child know where they might want to live?
It's a big, if you're trying to narrow it down, or I mean, it's an important thing to think about, depending on what your career path is and what you want to do. But that's something I think that you might miss. That is something that you might want to take into consideration.
And that's our job, really. It's because we're not writing the essay, we're not doing the interviews. But it is our job to help them see longer range, right? And so that's a great point, a great question. Like asking them, so where do you see yourself living? What it is that you would want to do,
right?
That it's a hard enough question. I can see how kids can get overwhelmed because they're trying to focus on what they even want to do for their life.
Yes,
and then there's all these other questions: where you want to live, and what lifestyle and what climate and all of that. Yep.
overwhelming, but it's something, if you're really skinning it down and your child's open to it, it's an important thing conversation. And secondarily to that, and we really, this was a big roadblock for us and was one of the reasons why Anthony ended up transferring, is because we didn't put enough focus and account specifically into his major, which sounds silly because like it feels like that would maybe be a no-brainer, but with some majors like business, for example, there's so many different sects to it that it's like SECTS. I know I did. Yep. I know I thought that as soon as I said it, but there's so many different routes you can go. And he ended up at a school that on the surface was like, oh, fine, he can get to where he needs to, right? Like just by going finance or economics. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what he needed to be at a school that had a really good business program.
Right.
And he was like, I just don't have, the classes aren't being offered to me. And we got so wrapped up in so many other things that we didn't skinny it down. So that's really important to think about too.
Yeah. Sometimes you learn on your second and third child, right?
Yeah. And but I'm hoping that we can have this conversation and maybe save some of you that are.
No, that's the point. So back to your point about getting some help.
Yep.
Again, even if your child is really super motivated, some things that we learned about the essay, back in the day when we were writing it, it would be like, oh, my name is Lynn and my hobbies include, it's a little bit about me, and you're showcasing yourself and your interests and your grades and all of that. Oh my gosh, it's jumped so far from that. That college essay is to look nothing like that. And I think they even have many reels on social media making fun of that. It's, when we took some classes that were offered by some counseling firms that specifically help students do better on the ACT and et cetera. And, when we were reading some of these examples, and you can Google it, you can Google Johns Hopkins college essay admissions examples. So use that search term, and there's a PDF that will come up, and you can read some of these essays. It's so esoteric. It's so you have to speak about yourself as a student without speaking of yourself. You have to tell stories, or what they would call vignettes, that are completely not even connected. It's like you're reading this like award-winning kind of out there short story, right? I mean that it's really out there. The one essay that I read was about a girl in Costco, and that went viral with college admissions counselors. Apparently, it was like and she was talking about how she's going down the aisles in Costco, but she would pick up a product and she would bring in some aspect of herself around that product. And that essay went viral. I think my daughter ended up with the advice. So my getting to say is get some help with the essay. Have an expert read it, because it can be certainly make or break.
And ask to see your child's essay too, right? There's nothing wrong with that, to give some input.
It depends on your relationship with them, but yeah, I mean, I'm the proofreader in our house, so I just help with spelling mistakes and error, or if something wasn't super like flowing, I would just kind of point it out. She also got her English teacher to weigh in, and they were so gracious to do a couple readovers of that. But to start, we had paid an expert for that. We did some hourly sessions. And just so you know, we were wanting help with the process in addition to what we got at our school. And some of the quotes we got for that were like insane, outrageous, like 5-figure quotes to help our daughter get into schools that she can get into on her own. I mean, I think maybe that would be worth it if you had a decent shot at getting into, again, a very low admission rate, very low acceptance rate school.
Yeah.
You had a decent shot already going into it. Because don't waste your money. If you're far from that, they can't give you any magical information. Right? There's only a few ways you can get into those schools. And there certainly isn't like somebody with average grades.
No, at the end of the day, you have to it starts with the grades. Like you have to, and that makes me, it hurts my heart a little bit, because I think about like, you're setting the bar, like you're not leveling the playing field. Like so you can afford to pay for that. So it makes it easier for you to get it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, but the sensible side of me is just saying, well, somebody's willing to pay that, but guess what? That's not going to guarantee that they get in,
no, there are no guarantees from
right?
what I've seen. I've seen now over the course of this several years, so many different walks of life and different, like it just, there is no like hard and fast rule of, oh, if you do this, this is going to get you in. If there was, everyone would do it and you'd get into the school you wanted to.
That's
So
right.
it's really, that is a tricky thing. So, and back to the essay, like you're right, maybe not ask. I guess that could be private. Maybe your child doesn't want to share, and that's okay too. I was just thinking to myself, remember sitting at the fire and that laugh we had with Andrew? Remember? When I was a
sure
young
do. I
lad.
didn't know if you wanted to share that, but
I
yeah.
don't mind. I'm pretty much an open book because he didn't use it. He went back and like he didn't, obviously, because we made so much fun of him. But so here's the story. It was the summer of Andrew's junior year, going into
Senior
senior
year.
year. And with his school and his advisor, like he had to have the first draft of his essay done in like June or something, and or July, maybe it was, whatever it was. And so Lynn was in visiting. We were up at the lake in New Hampshire and we were sitting around the fire and he was like, so Dad, like, do you think like Ken, I think Ken was telling us the story after the fact, right? It wasn't happening in real time. And Ken was like, yeah, Andrew came to me and was like, what do you think of this essay? Like the start of this essay. Do you think this sounds good? Does it sound like me? Ken was like, it read, when I was a young, and he obviously wasn't saying this, but Ken was embellishing. When I was a young lad and I would stop and get gas, I would ponder my life as a young, and Ken, we were like, well, what did you say to him, Ken? And Ken was like, I told him, hell no, did you GTP or GPT that? That's terrible. It doesn't sound like anything you would say. Start over.
Oh my gosh, we did laugh quite a bit at that. But, yeah, I think it's important to write that from their own voice. I think that's a lesson of just teaching your children. It's always good to sound authentic. You can be super witty and disarming and effective just being you.
Yeah.
Right?
So anyway, my point is like, you might want to check in with your kid and what they're writing if they're not. Yeah. I mean, his advisor, I'm sure, knew Andrew well enough if he had turned that in to say no.
I'm reading that essay. That's too important of a decision to not at least check in. So,
yeah.
But I know some people who are like, yeah, I guess they did and turned it in and like had no involvement. So just whatever works, I guess.
I do too, but I know people that have done that and then their child was heartbroken because they had their heart set on a school that they didn't get into. So and it's like, oh, well, could I have done more? Like maybe I should have been more involved. Right. Or
better to check in and not have a regret later.
I do think it's better to cover all your bases, even if it's too much, than to look back and say, man, like I have this kid that had a big plan for what they wanted to do. Yeah. And could I have done something more?
My last point here is in being realistic. We have kids that I've been around and listening to them. They're saying, in this process, oh, I'm going to go to that school and I think I could get a full ride. And I'm just sitting back and go, maybe you can, but somebody should, I feel, have a conversation. I could just tell that it hadn't occurred in that household about what is realistic.
Yes.
So that they can check themselves because, we both had experiences where it can be disappointing, if you apply to a school and you don't get in.
Yes. And to that point, like be prepared depending on what school they're at and what all the kids around your kids are doing, because it's really stressful and they might not speak it. I didn't know that till after the fact with Andrew, how stressed he was because he didn't speak it, but it led to like really a lot of stress. And I just thought he was like wanting to be alone and like to the point where he just was ready to move on and go to school. But what it really was he was stressed and just keeping to himself about it and trying to cope, because here we had a kid that it had applied to all these schools and all the students and friends around him are getting into schools, and he got into a couple but was waiting on the schools he wanted or had been waitlisted on the schools he wanted. And it can be unfortunately a very stressful time. And at the end of the day,
Humbling.
I'm
It's a humbling
convinced
experience.
it's a very humbling experience. And by the way, we talk about this a lot. You can't protect your kids from all, like, sometimes things don't work out and you might not get into the school you want. And guess, I mean, that's unfortunately life. That sounds harsh, but the sooner our kids learn that it's not always going to work out for them and how to cope and see the forest through the trees and see the good things that come out of it, the better for them.
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
like,
And if they don't have things not go their way in your house, then there's no way to predict how they're going to handle it outside of your house. I'd rather have that happen, those
yeah,
disappointments early on. And
right.
many of them, honestly, because that's life.
Exactly. And I also think in this case, from what I've seen, is that it works out the way it should. So Andrew didn't get into some of the schools that he had his heart set on, but he landed, let me take that back, because the school he's at was at the top of his list too. But some of these others that were like on even playing field, he didn't get into, but he's at the right place for him. I couldn't imagine. And by the way, that's where I wanted him to go from the start, but I never spoke that to him because I was like, that he's got to make his decision.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important piece too. We can give advice to our kids. At least that's how I parent, but I want them to make their own decision. I don't want them to even have in the back of their head that they're making one because I'm leading them. Or the flip side, a lot of times what I've seen is if I'm telling them, they're going to do the opposite just because I told them. So they're better off to just make the decision. Or and PS, if I had sort of like been pushing them to go to this one school and then they get there and they hate it, who do you think they're going to blame? Not themselves.
Yeah, it certainly is their decision, and they should be in control of that. I can imagine that there are kids that, for whatever stages of maturity they're at, might put it off or tend to procrastinate or not reach for something, afraid,
Yeah.
being fearful to fail. And that might be when you do have to prompt and stay on top of them and
Yes.
push them. They definitely recommend starting the paperwork the summer of your junior year, the
Meaning the
essay.
summer going into senior year,
I'm
right?
sorry. Yes, thank you. The summer
You could
after
say it
junior
either way,
year.
but
Yep. So the resume, most of the schools use the Common App, which your kids' school will usually help them get
mm-hmm.
set up, or they can start an account. I think we had some homework check marks, and it was to apply for FAFSA over the summer for a student account and parent account, which is the federal student aid, to set up the Common App application, I believe, or perhaps they did that with school, to start the first draft of your essay, to accumulate all your experience for the resume, because the stress of all of that coming to a head when it gets to be November 1st, which is the first deadline. It's the early action
Yep.
deadline,
Yep.
which if you really got a couple schools that you would really like to go to, it's very much advised to apply by November 1st, because they're going to fill up a good amount of their seats in that
Yes.
first round, and there's not going to be as many left over for the second round, right? So the second round is usually reserved for, all right, you did your November 1st applications, you got into a few, you're not really sure about the ones you got in. So let's put out a few more feelers and see what else is available and what we can get as options on the table.
Yeah.
So that's what that's reserved for, is my understanding. I hope I'm giving good advice there.
Yep. Yes. And should we break down ED and
Yeah, I had so I'm Canadian. Maybe most people understand that, but there's
I didn't know.
early action. So you mean you, by submitting your application by November 1st, you're giving the school, that's the latest. You can do it earlier too. I didn't realize that. Did you know that? You can
If you're doing early
apply to a
action.
college on October 1st, or
Yes, but there's to a point. Like, I don't think they'll accept it. Every school opens up application at
correct.
some point.
Yeah, they just
so
don't
some of
want to
it's
be getting
September,
them
maybe
all
the
year
end of
round.
August,
Yep.
but like they have a deadline if you're going early, or there's rolling admission where you can just apply at any point in time. So
Right.
yeah.
But so early decision, that gives that school a good indication, a strong indication that you desire to go there. Okay. There's also early decision, which, if you have one school that stands out among all the others and you would be just delighted to go there, you're committed to go there as long as you get in,
Mm-hmm.
you have the option at many schools, not all schools, to apply under the early decision.
Yep.
But keep in mind, it's financially binding. So it's like a contract. If
Yes.
you check that box that says early decision and you get in, you have to go to that school. You cannot change your mind. And you will hear that over and over and over again.
So you don't early decision more than one school. It's the school that's your kid's dream school, the school that all their eggs are in that basket. It could be a little bit of a reach too, because if you ED to a school, typically your percentage rate of getting in becomes bigger. It's a better chance of you being able to get in, which is a good thing. And but you're right, you're locked into that. And here's the thing that becomes like, this is where like a little bit of strategy comes into play, because if your child has a school, and I think you were a little bit in this situation, that they know that they really want to go to, but they're pretty certain they're going to get in regardless, it might not be worth it to do an ED, because you want to just be able to keep your options open.
Right.
You know, so that's where there's like some strategy there. The ED, I would
do
reserve.
not have to apply to any school ED.
No. And some schools don't even offer it.
Right. But you should apply to as many as you can early action. Or your child. Listen to me. I'm like,
I would agree with
I'm Rodney
that.
Dangerfield over here, and I'm going back to school.
Yeah.
Like I'm the one. I kind of
Melissa McCarthy.
I think, yeah. Oh my gosh, Life of the Party. That's such a great movie. Yeah, check it out.
But yeah, I think that I think early action, if for no other reason, just because you get the application in, it's in by November 21st, and you're hearing a lot of
November 1st, not 21st.
November 1st. And then you're hearing back but from a lot of schools before holiday Christmas break, you know, so that's kind of nice to have that. Now, the downside of that is if you can get deferred, like Andrew did early actions, and it was still like, you know, then all these months until we heard. So that can be stressful, but still, at least you have the schools in that you want. Yep. And if you start to see things come in that you're waitlisted or deferred, or it was an outright no, you can always go back to the schools that are rolling admission and add some more down the road.
Yep. That's good. Very good. Hopefully that was helpful. Anything else about colleges? I mean, all of this was so new to me. I kind of find it fascinating. It's a bit of a game. Mm-hmm. When we went to the classes that we took from the counselor, the ACT counselors, mm-hmm. It was so eye-opening, because I think a lot of people think grades, and not every school prioritizes that. Most schools want your child to be well-rounded. Mm-hmm. They want assurance that your child has lived a life where they can handle setbacks, mm-hmm. and anything that you can do that can demonstrate that, meaning you took on responsibilities in different clubs, or you're this kind of a person because you volunteered for this or what have you. I mean, just do as much of that as you can. And anything really, what I gather, anything super unusual, mm-hmm. will help you stand out. So the more unique you are, the more desirable you become as a candidate.
Yes.
In addition to your grades.
Absolutely.
Grades are not the end all be all, though.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, one last thing, because you brought up the ACT. So you have the ACT or the SAT. And I would encourage you, if you don't know this, to have your child, you can do the PSAT or the PACT, which is like a practice. They do that, I think, sophomore year.
A lot of schools do it.
Yeah. And it's not turned in. It's basically just like a dry run, a practice. But have your child do both, just so they can see what they're most comfortable with or what they think is going to be the best test for them. And then you can go and focus in on them, however they're going to study for that, whether it's taking classes, they do it on their own, group setting, like what have you. But also, like, we got to this place where a lot of colleges you don't have to turn in the test score anymore.
They're
like when we went to school, it was a no-brainer. You had to turn in the test. But from my understanding, we're now starting to circle back around, and more schools are requiring it again.
The trend is trending up for more schools to be accepting it or requiring
to be taking it again. And in the schools that don't, many of them, it's like it's not a requirement, but if you're not turning it in, you better have this level of grades then.
Yeah, because that's what they're assuming. So they're assuming, and I heard this from a college counselor's mouth. If you don't turn in your grade, it means that you weren't in the high percentile.
which would
just
be
me.
the assumption.
And then they kind of assume the worst, that you actually bombed it. Like they assume you did actually pretty
Yeah.
bad on it. So to your point, like, yeah,
Yep.
have good grades. And know if your school is test optional or not, obviously, or maybe not. Obviously, maybe you don't know any of this, but it went away during COVID to equalize the playing field for the students that had disadvantages
Yep.
with geographic regions and economics and
Yep.
different restrictions and so forth for not being able to attend school.
Mm-hmm.
Just like so many things were equalized during that time. But that's why it's trending back up again, because we're finally coming out of those years and kind of, you know, for lack of a better terminology, getting back to normal.
Right. And last thing, because we've probably gone over, but it is worth mentioning from what we've learned and what I've seen with my own kids when taking either the SAT or the ACT, and maybe you'll speak differently, but at least have them do it 2 times. And if they're not happy with the grade they got, have them do it a 3rd time. But statistics show that anytime your child takes it after a 3rd time, it's not going to get any better. And it might just end up getting worse because it's just like too much.
Even with
they
help?
get burnt out.
Even with help? Like the services that say, we guarantee we will increase your score by XXX.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's 2 times, 3 times is the max.
Is the max.
And if you don't know, like, they will take, like with the SAT anyway, they'll take your 2 best scores. So in other words, you're taking math and English, and maybe you took it on this date and you did good in math, but not as great as English, but you took it the 2nd time and you didn't do as great as math you did, but they'll combine your 2 best scores. Yep. So it's always worth it to do it at least 2 times just because of that. And a 3rd time because you're learning, you know, you're learning more, not only in school, but you've had the opportunity to study more. So
yeah, I would say don't prompt your child, which was a mistake I made, to take that test too early, because they're not even, they haven't even learned that math in class. So what they're testing, and I just thought it was a good idea, get in there. And I, again, didn't take the test, so I thought it was more like of an IQ test, but it's not. It's an applied, like you get to apply the knowledge that you've been learning in high school. And yeah, so too early will backfire because your child will lose confidence they'll get in there and they'll be like, what is this? Not knowing if they're supposed to know it or if it's something that just they're going to get taught later on down the road.
Yeah. And I think it depends on your kid's personality, but I think most kids would be set back by that and create some fear or stress that doesn't need to be there, or, you know, lower their confidence. So I agree. I think we were told, like, don't start until like the early spring or winter of junior year, because you're still learning. You're still getting math concepts even in fall of junior year that will be on that test. So you haven't even learned everything that you need to know yet.
I was so glad when you guys started bringing all of this college business up with us at the point that you did. So I feel it's almost like a pay it forward, you know? So anytime someone asks me now, I'm like, okay, but did you know this? Like, you need to know that. And, you know, so just take what you need and discard the rest.
Yeah.
Just like all of our conversations, not everything's going to apply to you perfectly, but if you have a learner, you know, just kind of a mindset to grow and learn, just take what fits you and then throw the rest out.
Right. And I remember walking through that. I remember telling you everything we had learned, because it is kind of like interesting, and if you don't know, and it's nice to share. So, and my husband did a lot of that research because he just wanted to know and understand, you know, so that was helpful too. Not that you guys didn't do your own. I didn't mean to say it that way, but like he was like
he laid the
interested
groundwork
in looking in and understanding. And one other thing that I'll link, and it's also in our Amazon store, is the FISC guide, and they update it every year, but that's really helpful if you want to just look at different schools and their ratings. And make sure you look too, just the last thing, 2 things that you can look at is, one, if you just don't know, just so you have a gauge and you're winging it on your own, is like, what's their acceptance rate, because that will give you a good gauge of how hard it's going to be for your child to get in. And another thing that some people don't look at, but I think is really important, is what is their graduation rate? Because some of these colleges have rates where like 50% or less of the kids that go to that school graduate. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something you want to know. You want to get your kid to a school where you're pretty sure that the odds of them graduating from there are good.
Yep. Oh my
So,
goodness,
and you can
that's
find
really
that
cool.
online. So that's something that you can definitely search out too. So
Okay.
anyway, ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. If you want all of the current updates and to know what's going on in the Life After Kids world, definitely follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. The website is www.lifeafterkids.com, where you will find all of our free resources to help you navigate this phase of life, and our blog, and YouTube if you prefer to watch instead of listen.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Have a great day and an even better week.